Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Casual Word and Casual Word Radio, where we continue our endeavor to change the world one word at a time. I'm your host, Langley, and today we have a unique guest on. I say unique because we met through social media, and turns out we're from the same area. You guys know that follow me, and obviously who know me. I grew up in the Bristol area. Miss Nakeisha Rollins, that's joining us today, grew up in Johnson City. So it was a unique experience to have the discussion offline and find out that, hey, we're from the same small environment, small town, things that we discussed offline, just some of the things that you deal with when you're in a small town, and some of the things that we're trying to obviously fix, not only there, but abroad as well. So welcome, Ms. Nakeisha Rollins, for being here today. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule.
Thank you for having me.
So so we're going to jump right into that. Johnson City. So I know a lot of you guys may not know, those who are not from this area, Northeast Tennessee, Southwest Virginia. It's very small. It's I want to say like a kind of a microcosm of culture, because there are several universities there, but a lot of people who go to the university are relatively local or from kind of the Kentucky, West Virginia, North Carolina area. You know, we are in a place where we are about an hour, 2 hours away from much larger cities. So some people come to kind of escape that and experience a different pace and a different lifestyle. And you are in South Carolina, is that correct?
I am Columbia, South Carolina.
Columbia, man, fantastic. So let's just talk about the transition. Was it something that you felt in your spirit, or was it both something that was practical and spirit led, or was it just practical? I know some people just like, man, you know what, I got to go somewhere and start over.
It definitely was not practical. I've never been to Columbia a day in my life. For 2 years, God kept telling me to move. And initially, I thought he meant the ministry that I was a part of, but he soon revealed that he was completely talking about the Tennessee area. And so I kind of wrestled with it for back and forth for 2 years because I was getting a little frustrated. I'm a logistical kind of person, so I'm very visual. And so God wasn't giving me the details that I needed. And I learned very quickly. He doesn't always give you all of the details initially. But when he did finally reveal to me, I kept hearing move everywhere I went. Random people kept saying move. And so finally, I started preparing to move. And the moment I began to pack up to prepare to move is when he told me the place. And so I came in the middle of a pandemic to a place I've never been to, never visited, didn't know what was going to happen. But I had made up in my mind that I had was stagnant for too long. And so I had to see what God had in store. So,
And that's important, because that place of stagnation is somewhere that can really cripple a person, and both spiritually, emotionally, mentally, and physically. How did you navigate the stagnation prior to your move? I guess specifically, you're talking about the ministry that you were a part of, and even in your personal life, maybe you felt that there was an area where you're not seeing much growth, and God was like, okay, I'm going to take you somewhere. But oftentimes before he moves us, there's work to be done in the current place. Did you find that your work was more separation, or was it more acceptance? Like what did you have to do prior to even the preparation of moving to keep yourself in a good place spiritually up until the point that you had to leave?
I always try to keep a community. And so I have a group that we call ourselves the Graceful Five. And so we're always, praying for each other, seeking God on each other's behalf, but also having conversation with my previous leader. Because I always felt like, if it was God telling me, of course, he was going to reveal it to my leader so that I can leave, on a good note and not abruptly. And so just seeking them out. And then things just became more and more uncomfortable. I just felt like I was no longer supposed to be in the place, but I just didn't know where I was supposed to be, if that makes sense. I kind of felt like my time was up. I don't know
No,
how to explain it, but
I know that feeling. I know exactly what that feeling is.
yeah. So things just started becoming more and more uncomfortable in the ministry, as well as in my personal life. And so I just knew that it was time. I didn't know where, but I just knew that it was time.
Well, and that's important to highlight, because so often, and I grew up in an era of church where, that's where you stay. That's where, your parents, your grandparents, the grandchildren, your children, right? That's generational. And, what we realize now as we are becoming more in alignment is that there are going to be certain seasons under certain leadership. And there's going to be certain seasons around a certain congregation and a certain ministry. And then there's going to be a time, right, for a shift, as my pastor talks about often. So prior to understanding that the shift was imminent, your relationship with Christ, was that something that came later on in your life, or were you kind of like many of us, especially in the Bible Belt, we grew up in church, we might have stepped away for a while, but we still had a very deep connection with Christ. So was it kind of, and I asked that because you talk about praying and knowing and seeking out the right leadership and making certain decisions that a lot of people wouldn't even have considered. They would just say, you know what, I'm just going to go. I ain't got no plan. I'm just out. But you talk about, praying for understanding, praying for guidance. And so that leads to a certain level of spiritual maturity. And so I'm just curious, like, how did you develop that?
Actually, I did grow up in church, but it kind of came later. My family didn't go to church. I actually came to God at 5 years old by mere strangers. My curiosity, my mother was a teenage mother, so we lived with my grandparents. And so at the corner of where they lived, there was this brick building, and I would always see every Sunday when my granddad and I would go to the store, people dressed up and going into this building. And so one Sunday morning, I woke up, got dressed, and ran out the back door up the alley to this building because I was curious as to what was in that building. And long story short, a man and woman met me at the door. They asked me if I knew Jesus, told me he could live in my heart, and told me how, had me repeat a few words after them, and then told me to get home. And so by the time I came home, everybody was looking for me. And then shortly after that, my grandmother started going to church, and she started taking me with her. But my mother, she never went to church until like my teenage years. And so, I started having dreams and visions at 7 years old, didn't know what that meant, didn't have anybody to tell me what that meant. And so it wasn't until my going away from church, living a rebellious life, and coming back into church in my early 20s that I actually began to understand the spiritual side of things. And that was what my previous pastor, who, he and his wife walked me through everything that I was dealing with, and helping me to study scripture and, listen for God's voice. And they walked me through that process. And so that's how I began to understand what everything meant back when I was a kid, and that it was God.
Interesting. And it's always interesting because he will speak to us at any age, at any point, and at any time. And it's always wonderful to hear those types of stories and to remember those types of experiences, growing up, and whether you were with your parents, your grandparents, you grew up in church or not. I mean, there's always that pivotal moment. There's that encounter with a person that then leads you to that encounter with Christ, and then you begin to build that relationship. I want to talk about the transition, though. All right, because this is always the fun part: the rebellious life, and then back to church. All right. And back to trying to walk it out to where, we've been called to walk it out. Because I'll give you a great example. Went to New Jersey, met with my church, a lot of my people for the first time ever. Right. And so they're talking to me and they're asking, hey, pastor this, pastor that. And every time they say it, I'm looking at my pastor like, yo, are you good? Like, what do you need? And he's like, no, they're talking to you. And I was like, what? Hold on. So getting to that point, it was very surreal to have to still be in that process of accepting that that's part of the calling. But I starkly remember trying to figure out what that looked like practically, just following Christ in a very practical sense. How did you negotiate that transition back into, okay, God, I really want to do what you called me to do after you've, lived in the world, so to speak?
Well, I guess while I was out there in the world, I would say, think I was like 22 years old, maybe. And I started feeling like, I guess, a more of a conviction, like when I would do things, whereas before I wasn't too moved by it. But I started to feel a deep conviction when I would like do the things that wasn't pleasing unto God. And then I would find myself slowly, and I always tell people one thing that never left me was reading my word and praying. Like even in the world, I still will take time out to read and pray. And so I guess God just was telling me it was my time. And so I felt him pulling on me. And I had came home to visit in Tennessee for Thanksgiving 2007. And the church that I grew up at, I heard that there was a new pastor there. And so I had went to, listen to the word, meet the new pastor. And he had called a prayer line at the end. And so he had asked me why I was there. I was like, I used to be a member here. He was like, no, why are you here? And he said, God said it's time. And so when I left church that day, it's time kept resonating in my spirit. And so I had told my mom, because I was living in Atlanta at that time, and I told my mom, I said, I'm moving back home. And she was like, when? I was like, tonight. I was like, I just knew that I couldn't play with it. And so literally, I took my cousin, she rode back to Atlanta with me, packed everything, and moved back that same night. And, I came back to the church, and that's where I've been ever since.
Man, that's outstanding, because I was rebellious even when I was trying to walk.
Like I won't say I haven't been rebellious in other areas. I guess let me clarify. I still had those moments where I slowly walked my way into the position, and thank God for leaders that can see the call that God has on your life and help nurture those callings and the gifts that you have. And so my leaders seen things in me that I didn't see in myself or didn't even understand, and so he slowly would have me get involved with certain things. So I started out, helping with the youth, and then that slowly graduated into me being a youth leader. And then he was like, I need you to pray at noonday at the church. I'm like, I don't know how to pray. And he's like, that's okay. The Lord, he's going to help you in you doing this. He's going to develop you, and you'll begin to, be more attuned to his voice. And, this is how God is going to. So I started leading noonday prayer, didn't have a clue about praying. And I soon came to realize, prayer is mainly a conversation with God. And so just him slowly baby stepping me into things, because if he would have flat out asked me, he knew I would have said no. So I guess God showed him the way to kind of slowly push me into that. And then I kept having dreams and visions in 2011. And so I finally went to him, and I was like, I think it's time for me to, step directly into my call. And he was like, how do you know? I was like, because the Lord won't let me sleep. And so he was like, okay. And so 2011, I went into the aspiring training field of ministry. And then in 2014, I was ordained.
Well, that is outstanding. See, I didn't even know that. Welcome. So for all those who will be listening to this later, I guess this was also double as part of the pastor series. How fun is that? Something new. So
not quite pastor yet, not quite pastor, but
you're a minister, you're a leader, so that also qualifies. You're leading, you're still leading people, right? And that's the most important part. You're still leading people. How do you manage the reality of this life as you live it in the world, right? Being in the world but not of the world. How do you manage that and maintain, I don't want to say integrity, but you have to be approachable, and people have to feel like they can talk to you, and people have to feel like that there's some empathetic qualities that where they're coming from. So how do you meet people where they are, and still be able to maintain the integrity of your walk?
And I like the fact that you use meet people where they are, because that's one thing that I say all the time, that not everybody's going to come into the building. We have to meet people where they are. And I think being an outcast, having experience with rejection, having experience, in the world, I think that helps me to be more relatable to individuals that have been outcasted, or that people count out or whatever. And I pray all the time that God allows me to see people through his eyes. And I don't want to sound cliche, but I mean, prayer, it really works. Prayer and scripture and spending that time with God and just, having that compassion with people, because you never know what people are dealing with. And I remember, being that person in their situation and not having somebody reach down and help me, and having to kind of find God on my own. And so I know the struggles of being on the other side. And so because of that, I know, what it feels like to be alone. I know what it feels like not to feel like you have anybody or to feel like you're not good enough, and the many things that people deal with. And so that in itself, because I've experienced that, has caused me to have compassion and love towards people. I mean, God says, with loving kindness have we drawn thee. And so I strive, that's my passion. We have to show love to people, even our enemies, even those who come up against us. You have to love people, forgive people, let God judge people.
That's it. We have to continue to do what we've been called to do, which is to care and do our best to be compassionate with every individual that we encounter. So on that note of love and compassion, let's talk about the glass ceiling of women in ministry. What has been your experience with that, and just all around the board? I mean, have you been, you talked about rejection. Has that happened since you've been in your position, not being able to speak or not being able to participate in certain things? I mean, that's a very real thing that I've seen, and I've had a couple other female ministers and a couple of female pastors on. So I definitely want to get your experience on that.
Yeah, and not to, speak against any particular denomination. Every denomination has their rules. But I did grow up Church of God in Christ, and, they don't have women pastors. Women can't speak from the pulpit. And pretty much in the time that I was growing, even though I knew I had a prophetic gift, they didn't have, prophetesses, or either if you was a woman and you wanted to be in ministry, you had to be labeled a missionary, because that's pretty much the only position they had, either an evangelist missionary or a deaconess missionary. And so even though I knew God had called me to a different place, I had to be a missionary, and that's what I was called. And so, but I'm not completely upset about it, because it did, I did get an opportunity to go on mission trips in other countries. And so I did have that experience. And then it also, I guess I can say I've learned a lot of what not to do when it comes to church and ministry. So I'm not completely upset about the experience, but yeah, not being able to speak from a pulpit, having to stand out on the ground and get inspirational messages, not actually preaching. Things like that. Yeah, I've dealt with that a lot in ministry.
Is that something that you're still dealing with, or let me reframe that question. Have you had opportunity to speak outside of that denomination, or have those opportunities not happened for you outside of the denomination as well?
It actually happened within. So my leader was one of those individuals. He paid attention and listened to what God was saying, not necessarily man's rules or denominations. And so he allowed us as women to use our gifts and to speak from the pulpit. And so we had what we called Women's Sundays. So I would preach on Women's Sundays. I taught Sunday school. And then even relocating here to South Carolina, the first church that I was affiliated with, I taught Bible study, I spoke on Sundays. And so they weren't as traditional as what I grew up in. And then the ministry that I'm involved with now, they have women bishops, women pastors, women ministers. He's actually, they recently affirmed me in the gift that God has given me. So yes, I do missions, and I love the mission field. I love going to other countries. However, I know that's not, the office that God has called me to. And so they have recognized the office that God has called me to, and they have affirmed me in that office. So yes, I now have the experience to. I don't like to preach. I will. I'm not an in front of everybody kind of person, but I feel like that's probably where God is calling me to, because I'm always getting some kind of request to speak in front of people or something. So I think God is slowly pushing me into that. Right. But yeah.
Well, change is uncomfortable. And we talked about that just briefly offline. And so often God is going to continue to navigate you into that place of discomfort because that is where you're supposed to be going. And that's definitely how he operates.
Indeed.
That's beautiful, and it's so empowering and so encouraging to hear that people are being more progressive in their thinking, especially inside the church. There's some organizations that I was a part of, and we talked specifically about removing prejudices and not being sexist and not being so closed-minded to what God is doing. Because like you had stated, so many of the things that God has called us to do, man gets in the way of because of his own proclivities and his own desires and aspirations. And so there's been, probably innumerable women who could have and should have been doing great things, but were stifled.
Exactly.
And so it's definitely beautiful to hear that that's because where I'm at now, it's unique in the Virgin Islands that I don't see a lot of women in leadership in faith-based organizations, right? Whether it's a nonprofit or an actual church, I don't see, and I've not met a lot of women in leadership. And so I'm still trying to understand culturally if that is the culture exacerbated by religious belief systems, or if it's just they haven't caught their times yet, right? So it's great to hear that things are progressing. Let me ask, as we were getting ready to wrap up, what would you give as encouragement to young women, not only to encourage them to not follow the status quo and not be just another trend or another number in terms of what people are doing and what young kids are doing, especially, but also what advice you would give someone who is considering that ministry might be that calling and they're trying to understand, trying to move into that world?
I would encourage them to, I guess, find someone that's already in that role to kind of mentor them, to ask questions, somebody that, has been in the experience of possibly the rejection and now is operating in ministry. One thing that I struggled with for many years was, worrying about what other people had to say or trying to fit the mold that other people were trying to put me in. And in doing that, I was neglecting, who God was calling me to be, to a point where I didn't know who I was supposed to be because I was trying to do this and be for that person. And so I lost focus on who it was that God was calling me to be. And so the number one thing that I always tell people now is, we have an audience of one, and that's God. And so we have to value God's opinions over anybody else's, because people will have you in positions and doing things that God never called you to. Mm-hmm. And it's just going to bring a whole world of stress and confusion and trouble for you. And so continue to seek God. The word lets us know to seek ye first. And so we have to, and everybody's not going to be okay with it because God didn't call them, he called you. And so if he told you, it's not always going to make sense to other people. Mm-hmm. And so be mindful of who you tell things to as well. Have people in your corner that is going to pray God's will for you, and that God, will reveal things as you go along, and to seek him for yourself. I do believe in prophetic gifts and ministries. Of course, I have that gift myself, and I believe in encouraging and, praying for one another, but we also have to be able to hear God for ourselves and not depend on other people to tell us, what thus saith the Lord, and to find out what it is that God has called us to, and not to let people put limits on you, and take the limits off yourself, because sometimes we put limits on ourselves. And just to find your confidence in God and who God has called you to be.
And that's a great word. I hope that everybody who's going to be listening to this really takes that to heart, both men and women, because this applies to everybody, but definitely for young women. We're living in an age now, and it's Women's History Month, and some of the things that women are doing that should have been obviously not only just allowed, but just something we should have been celebrating, for decades now. And so we definitely want to highlight the fact that we want our young women, especially our young Black women, to have opportunities to be whatever it is they want to be, and to be what they've been called to be. So I definitely want to highlight that as we are closing. And I also want to mention that, like Ms. Rollins was saying, you have to make sure that you hear God for yourself. If the prophetic word that you receive is somehow in conflict, then you need to go back and be praying. Because anytime that I've had a prophetic word, and I think that you probably had the same experience, it always confirms something that I already heard in my spirit, or something that I already kind of talked to God about, or something that he was already had that unction in me to want to fulfill. And then someone else confirmed, yes, in fact, this is what you're supposed to be doing, or this is what I've called you to do. So for anybody who's going to be watching this, if you have a word or receive a word that somehow is not in line with what you're feeling in your spirit, just go back and pray about that thing. Because it could be that you're hearing incorrectly. It could be you're in the wrong place. It could be that you're hearing the wrong prophetic word. Those things do happen. So you want to make sure it's why you stay in your words, why you stay in prayer, it's why you fast, why all the things that we talk about, guys, often. That's why they're so important, because those things help you to discern what direction you're supposed to be going in. Ms. Rollins, any final thoughts from you? Thank you again for being here.
You're welcome. I guess one thing I should have said too is, to understand and know that you have a voice, and to use your voice. Don't let anybody silence you. God, the word says that he has, given us gifts. He didn't say man, female. We all have a gift. We all have a work to do. And so don't let anybody discount you because you are a female. You have a voice just like the next person, and God can use you. If he can use a donkey, he can use you. So
Absolutely. And speaking of a voice, you have a book out. Am I right?
I do. Mm-hmm.
Please tell us, give us a title, maybe give us a little tease, and where can we find that?
It's Pain to Purpose, and I share my testimony, my experience of, some things that I experienced in my childhood and growing up, and how God, allowed me to go from pain into walking into my purpose. And I, share with others ways that they can go and walk in their purpose and learn how to share their stories and overcome. You can find it on Amazon. You can order it directly from me on Pain to Purpose, which is on Facebook, or my personal Facebook, which is Nakeisha Y. Rollins. And then I also have a podcast that coincides with the book. So.
Man, out here doing big things is what we like to see. Connecting and changing the world. So guys, make sure you get a copy of that. If you haven't, I will put a link in the description once I have it, so that way you guys can have access to that, get a copy of that. I'm an avid reader. Not only do I write books, but I read a lot of books, and I think it's imperative that we read all that we can so that we can learn everything we can, and that way we can do as much as we can. So again, this has been Ms. Nakeisha Rollins. Thank you so much for taking time out to join us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Guys, it's always a pleasure. Don't forget that also 40 Days and Nights, Journey Through the Wilderness, is available on Amazon as well. Get yourself a copy of that. Guys, if you want to donate to the cause, you can do that on the Anchor website, or you can cash at me if you feel so led to do so. I appreciate everybody who's already just blessed me and been able to sow into this ministry and sow into the things that I'm trying to accomplish. So thank you all for that. Thank you all for your journey. Guys, this has been another wonderful episode, wonderful conversation. Hope that you were blessed from this. As always, let's change the way that we think so we can change the way that we live. Until next time, stay blessed.